So I just had a long discussion with Jocko Willink, and Jocko states very forthrightly in that interview, that discussion, that ever since he was 3 years old, he wanted to be a soldier, and he disavows any higher order moral virtue to that desire. He wanted to go out and be a soldier, to do what soldiers do. It was intrinsic. It was an intrinsic part of his personality. And make no mistake about it, I mean, we've been warriors forever, and some people are born like that, and he's definitely one of them. But he's highly socialized. We get less aggressive as we age, human beings. The most violent creatures are 2-year-olds. Punch, kick, hit, bite, steal. That's the definition. Physical violence. Okay. 2-year-olds, if you group people together in age similar groupings, the 2-year-olds have the most violent altercations. But then if you look at the 2-year-olds, it's a minority of the 2-year-olds who are violent. They're almost all male, and it's a small minority of the males. Okay, most of those males are socialized out of that antisocial aggression by the time they're 4. Those that aren't are permanently antisocial, although that declines after the age of about 27. So let's take that minority of aggressive kids. So, well, what does it mean to be aggressive? And this pertains to psychopathy. Psychopathy isn't a unitary dimension. It's not a personality attribute. It's a combination of traits. And so a real psychopath is low in agreeableness. So low in compassion, low in politeness. That's the best personality predictor of criminal behavior. It's not very good, but it's the best one. And they're low in conscientiousness. Okay, so they have a parasitic lifestyle, that's low in conscientiousness, and they have no empathy. That's bad news. And then you can decorate the psychopathy. You could add low neuroticism to that, so there's no fear. You could add assertiveness from the extroversion dimension. So like your ultimate psychopath might be charming and assertive, right? Low in fear, low in agreeableness, low in conscientiousness. So they don't care about you. They'll exploit you for the future. They don't forego gratification, but they're charming. Then you can decompose that and you can say, well, those constituent elements of those traits are often extremely useful. Now, Jocko and his crew, the Navy SEAL types, they're deadly when you put them out against an enemy, but they're unbelievably socialized. Like Jocko stated very straightforwardly and makes a very credible case that the Navy SEALs their fundamental motivation isn't status for themselves, it's to protect the other people in the group. They're incredibly group affiliated, and I think you see that in any functional group of competitive men, is they compete for the position, but they have each other's backs. And if they don't, what you do with a guy like that, who you can't trust in the clinch, is you isolate him. Even if he's competent, if he won't subserve that competence to the group, you don't trust him, because in order to be in a position of authority for any length of time, you have to play an iterable game. It has to be able to repeat. And unless you engage in reciprocal behaviors with others, you can't dominate a social group for very long, because it'll rebel. So there's real constraints on the exercise of power in any functional hierarchy. And you even see that among chimps. Franz de Waal has documented this extremely well. The tyrant chimp can prevail momentarily, but the probability that he's going to get taken out is extremely high. And it's actually the pro-social chimp who's strong and fearless, let's say, that's much more likely to have a stable reign, let's say. So you can even see that in chimps. So I'm leery of the, CEOs equal psychopath argument. It's like, well, yeah, they're competitive, but they're conscientious. So that ameliorates the psychopathy, right? Like a disagreeable, conscientious person is really useful to have around, because they will tell you exactly what they think. Because they don't care if they hurt your feelings, and that's kind of harsh. They will tell you, man, you'll know. But if they're conscientious, you can trust them. One of the things that happens very often in psychotherapy, people come to psychotherapy for multiple reasons, but one of them is they often come because they're too agreeable. And so what they get is so-called assertiveness training, although it's not exactly assertiveness that's being trained. What it is the ability to learn how to negotiate on your own behalf. And one of the things I tell agreeable people, especially if they're conscientious, is
say what you think. Tell the truth about what you think. There's going to be things you think that you think are nasty and harsh. And they probably are nasty and harsh, but they're also probably true. And you need to bring those up to the forefront and deliver the message. And it's not straightforward at all, because agreeable people do not like conflict. Not at all. They smooth the water. You know, and you can see why that is, in accordance with the hypothesis that I've been putting forward. You don't want conflict around infants. It's too damn dangerous. You don't want fights to break out. You don't want anything to disturb the relative peace. You know, and if you're also more prone to being hurt physically and perhaps emotionally, you're also maybe loath to engage in the kind of high-intensity conflict that will solve problems in the short term, because it takes a lot of conflict to solve problems in the short term. And, you know, if that can spiral up to where it's dangerous, which it can if it gets uncontrolled, it might be safer in the short term to keep the waters smooth and to not delve into those situations where conflict emerges. The problem with that is it's not a very good medium to long-term strategy, right? Because lots of times there are things you have to talk about because they're not going to go away. And so partly what you do with agreeable people is you get them to figure out, and they have a hard time with this too. If you ask a disagreeable person what he wants, say, or she wants, they'll tell you right away. They know. It's like, this is what I want and this is how I'm going to get it. But agreeable people, especially if they're really agreeable, are so agreeable that they often don't even know what they want, because they're so accustomed to living for other people and to finding out what other people want and to trying to make them comfortable and so forth, that it's harder for them to find a sense of their own desires as they move through life. And that's not, look, there's situations where that's advantageous, but it's certainly not advantageous if you're going to try to forge yourself a career. That just doesn't work at all.
This is part of the reason that I'm an admirer of Carl Jung, because Jung makes it very clear that, see, he was very interested in the barriers to enlightenment. Because if there's such a thing as being enlightened, let's say, then why isn't everyone enlightened? If it's just a matter of taking the glorious route and following your bliss, let's say, it's like, well, that sounds pretty easy. Why isn't everyone enlightened? But Jung's thinking isn't like that at all. You know, he believed that in order to transform your personality, that first of all you had to be disciplined, that's for sure, but you also had to integrate that part of you that was terrible and capable of breaking rules and make it part of you. And so then, and I really like that idea. Well, here's an example. So about 20 years ago, I would say, there was a newspaper headline in one of Canada's major newspapers, and it was the Minister of Foreign Affairs at that time, Lloyd Axworthy, and he was talking about what had happened with Milosevic in the former Soviet Union in Yugoslavia and the atrocities that were being committed. And he said that he was caught unawares by that because he didn't have the imagination for that kind of evil. And I thought, well, you know, you think that what you're doing is signaling your virtue by making a statement like that, but from my perspective, all you're doing is stating your cowardice and your historical ignorance, because if you're going to be Minister of Foreign Affairs, you bloody well better have imagination for that kind of evil, because if you don't, then anyone who does wins. They beat you. And so you know, again, in the Harry Potter stories, you see he's touched by evil, right? He actually has a soul fragment that's embedded within him that's as black as anything can possibly be. That's why he can talk to snakes. But without that, he wouldn't be able to have any victory. And that's exactly right psychologically. Unless you can think the way that an evil person thinks, then you're defenseless against them, because they'll go places you can't imagine and then they win. And so the best men I've met, it was interesting even when I was in junior high and high school, because most of my friends dropped out, you know, by the time they were grade 10, thereabouts. And a lot of them were guys who developed physically. They're pretty powerful, and they're just damn sick of putting up their hand to go to the bathroom. It's like, you know, they're not doing that anymore. One of my friends got kicked out when he sort of challenged the gym teacher, you know, physically. And the gym teacher, he could do an iron cross. He was a tough guy, and so it was no trivial matter for my friend to stand up to him, but he got expelled anyways. But, you know, I noticed that it was often the kids whose character I admired that either quit or got expelled, and they were the tougher guys who were just sick and tired of following rules that didn't take into account their character, and then they'd go off and work in the oil rigs or whatever, and you could do that in Alberta at that time. That was really hard work, you know, so it wasn't like they were necessarily taking the easy path. But like, a harmless man is not a good man.
A good man is a very, very dangerous man who has that under voluntary control. And you also see that, like one of the central female stories, let's say, if the hero archetype is the central male story, there are variants of hero archetypes that are relevant to women, and one of them is Beauty and the Beast. And Beauty isn't interested in the guy who isn't the Beast. She's interested in the guy who's the Beast, and that's exactly right, but she's interested in the guy who's the Beast that can be civilized and disciplined, right, and who can use that in the service, well, let's say, of a family.
Look, a great hunter, let's say, might become a leader in a hunter-gatherer group, but part of what makes him a great hunter is the fact that he shares. I mean, he hunts, but he has to share, and that's also to his benefit, because then if someone else hunts and is successful, he gets his share. But so there's the aggression that goes along with hunting, and the dominance that goes along with maybe the seeking of status in that particular domain. But no complex human hierarchy is sustainable without reciprocity. And that's why the Marxist criticisms of hierarchy as only based in power, they're just wrong. It's just not the case. When a hierarchy degenerates, then it becomes based on power. Any hierarchy, it could be a creative hierarchy, it could be a competency hierarchy. If it's power, then it's degenerated. It's become the evil tyrant, and then it's time for a revolution. And so, the revolutionary Marxist types can take that fundamental truth, which is that sometimes it's time for a revolution, and that's when power dominates. And they can use that as a motivator because it speaks to us very deeply. But it's very dangerous to apply that to situations where what's producing hierarchical position is multifactorial. And no one in their right mind, if they think about it, as far as I'm concerned, can say that the functional hierarchies that characterize most social organizations in the West, they're just not based on power. That's just wrong. Plumbers, competency. Lawyers, competency. Might be dominance and assertiveness and even a lack of empathy. Among prosecutors, for example, you have to have a killer instinct. But it's competence. It's ability to do the job.
Oh yes, I mean alcohol is a very bad drug for violence. 50% of people who are murdered are drunk, and 50% of the people who murder them are drunk. And that's true for almost every violent crime. In fact, if you eliminated alcohol, you'd eliminate most interpersonal violence.
Look, I find that this is kind of an interesting topic because I think it's interesting that alcohol is legal, and yet you do terrible things sometimes.
You probably couldn't have made any a worse drug legal,
right?
From an epidemiological perspective.
On the other hand, you have marijuana or psilocybin or LSD even, or some of these other drugs, and they make you thirsty, make you laugh, and you wake up feeling fine. I find it really fascinating that alcohol is the illegal one. How did that ever happen or is the legal one? Why does our system...
I think it probably happened because it was so easy to make and it was just everywhere. Right? Because all you really have to do is put barley in water and you get beer, right? So it was really easy to make, and at least in many societies it's been around for a very long time. And so it became legal just because, well, back in the Middle Ages, people drank alcohol, not water, because all the water was polluted.
Right.
Right, so that's the reason, but it certainly wasn't a consequence of evaluating the drugs by their comparative risk and rank ordering them and making, the least harmful legal. It wasn't that at all, because alcohol is unbelievably dangerous. I mean, about 10% of people become addicted to it in one way or another.
Really?
And far more people than that abuse it. Yes, at least once in their life, yes. Yeah. It's really bad. I studied alcohol for years. It was my subject of my PhD. We were interested in what factors made alcoholism hereditary, because it does seem to have a strong hereditary component. And what we basically concluded after doing a tremendous amount of research was that people who are prone to alcoholism, at least one type of person who's prone to one type of alcoholism, got a very, very powerful stimulant effect from the alcohol during the time that their blood alcohol level was ascending in the 10 or 15 minutes after they took a drink, especially if they took a large drink fast or multiple large drinks fast. You can probably tell, by the way, if you're one of these people, if you want to go do this in the bar the next time you go on an empty stomach, take your pulse, write it down, drink 3 or 4 shots fast, wait 10 minutes, take your pulse again. If it's gone up 10 or 15 beats a minute, look out, because that means alcohol is working as a psychomotor stimulant for you. And we found that for many of these people, that was an opiate effect. What seemed to happen was that when they drank alcohol fast, they produced probably beta endorphin, although we were never sure. It can be blocked with naltrexone, which is an opiate antagonist. Anyways, the other characteristic of that pattern of alcohol consumption is that the real kick only occurs when you're on the ascending limb of the blood alcohol curve. So, first of all, your blood alcohol goes up, and then it goes down. And generally, when it goes down, it's not pleasant. That's when you start to feel hungover. And a hangover is actually alcohol withdrawal, by the way. So it's like heroin withdrawal, except it's alcohol withdrawal. And it's generally not pleasant for people, so they usually sleep through it, or it puts them to sleep. But if you're one of these people who get a real kick on the ascending limb of the blood alcohol curve, then you can just keep pounding back the alcohol, and it'll keep hitting you and keep you in that position where you're, on the ascending part of the blood alcohol curve. And you can probably tell if you're one of these people if you can't stop once you get started. So if it's like you have 4 drinks quick, and it's like, man, you're gone until the alcohol runs out, or until it's 4 in the morning, or until you've spent all your money, or you've been at the last bar in town, or that you're sitting on your friend's bed after everybody's gone home from the party and you're still drinking, you might suspect that you're one of those people. And if you are one of those people, well, then you should watch the hell out, because alcohol is a vicious drug, and it gets people in its grasp hard, and it's hard for them to escape once they do.
They don't have a value hierarchy. So Pleasure Island, it's a good example. Those kids that were brought there were lost. So they didn't have anywhere to go. They didn't have an identity. So they default to local pleasure. And that's better than none. Although the problem with local pleasure, well, as the narrative made clear, is that you better look out if you're impulsive, because it's going to kick back on you hard. And the reason is, you're only considering the immediate time frame. And the problem is that things propagate across all the time frames. And so just because something works really well this second, cocaine, for example, doesn't mean that it's a tenable solution to the class of all problems. So usually, often, people pursue local pleasure because that's the best they can imagine. It's the best they've been taught. They don't see another alternative. So it can be ignorance. It can be they don't want to adopt the responsibility, because part of the problem with working at every level of the hierarchy simultaneously is that it's like dancing to a very complex waltz, let's say. You have to be paying attention to a very large number of things simultaneously and doing things right. It requires responsibility. And so, it's a pain. It's a weight. Part of the reason people drink alcohol is to get rid of their responsibility. I mean, that's, you hear people drink because they have problems. It's like, no. Some people drink because they're anxious, and alcoholics drink because they're in withdrawal. But young people drink because they're sick and tired of being responsible, because it's annoying. It's like, so I'll drink enough, I won't care about the medium to long-term consequences, because alcohol, that's exactly what alcohol does. It doesn't make you ignorant of the medium to long-term consequences, but it makes you not care about them. And partly it's because it dampens anxiety. So it dampens anxiety, leaves your positive emotion circuits intact, so then you can go out there and do stupid fun things. And that's a party, really. Let's go do stupid fun things. That's a party. But the medium to long-term consequences it's risky. It doesn't mean you shouldn't do it, but it's risky. So, yeah, they don't know better. That's the answer, I would say.
Like, make a plan. I would say do the future authoring program, because it isn't that you're trying to avoid booze exactly. It's that you're trying to restructure your whole life, because if you're a drinker, then all your friends are drinkers, and you're used to drinking in every social situation, and the places that you go to socialize are places that you drink, and like it's really built in as a whole set of habits. And so what you have to do is kind of redesign your life, and you have to think of things. You can't just stop drinking. You have to figure out what you're going to start doing instead of drinking. There's a hole that you have to fill in. And, you know, the future authoring program will also help you figure out what your life could look like in the absence of alcohol, and what kind of hell you could end up in if you keep drinking and it causes all the problems that it can cause. And I think you really need to, you need to think through the hell that can occur, and you have to think through how your life could be valuable without alcohol, so that you can be motivated enough to try to regulate it. And I would also say, if you fail and slip, don't berate yourself and beat yourself up. Just start quitting again, because you know, if you can cut your alcohol intake down 75%, that's a hell of a lot better than zero. And often people go all or nothing, just like they do when they're quitting cigarettes. And you know, they'll quit for a month and then have a cigarette, and they'll say, "Oh my God, now I've broken the pact," and then they'll smoke a whole pack and they'll be smoking again. You don't have to do that. You can just decide that you slipped and that you're going to get back on the wagon again. And you know, it can take a long time, but I do believe that you need a better vision of life, right? You have to find something to do that's better than alcohol. And that might take some real consideration, especially if alcohol is a very potent drug for you. And I would also say, don't hesitate to try the naltrexone. It's got a pretty decent clinical history, and it's basically harmless. What's the best way to stop drinking alcohol and start doing my best in my psychology degree? It's affecting my study, but I can do very well if I stop. I'm 26. Well, Paul, what I would say is, I think you should do the future authoring program, and you should really concentrate. There's a section in it that helps you determine what your positive view of your future would be, but another section that helps you determine what would happen in your life if your negative habits got out of control. And one of the things that can really help you control your alcohol intake is to really, really think through what you're giving up and where you could be in 5 years if you don't get it under control. And proclivity to alcoholism can be a really vicious thing. You know, lots of people get dragged down into the mud by alcohol, excessive alcohol intake, especially if they're sensitive to the opiate response that alcohol can produce. And you can tell that when you drink, you know, you get alert and let's say more enthusiastic and energetic, and then you don't want to stop drinking. That's definitely a bad sign with regards to developing alcoholism. So I would say you need to figure out something that's more important to you than drinking. Think through very hard the negative consequences of continuing it. You're at about the age, 26, where you should stop. I mean, guys who are going to stop generally start to slow down pretty intensely around that age. You know, also treating your psychology studying as a full-time job can also be helpful. So, you know, get up at 8 in the morning or 7:30 in the morning and start hitting the books by 9, and put in a 6 to 8 hour day. And then even if you do keep drinking, at least you're moving forward. So that's what I would say about that. Life has a tragic element, you know, because we're vulnerable, all of us, and we know it, which is the particularly human curse, let's say. We're aware of our vulnerability, and it's not just vulnerability in the tragic sense, it's also the human proclivity for evil that makes the tragedy of life even worse than it would otherwise have to be. And you could say that that's a basic truth. You could even say that that's a basic truth with regards to the meaning of life. You know, it's a pessimistic way of looking at it in some sense, but it leads to an optimistic conclusion. All of us have to face our limitations and malevolence in the world, and the possibility that we'll be betrayed or betray other people and act improperly, and that's a heavy burden. But the truth of the matter is, as far as I'm concerned, that each of us has enough potential character, power of character, let's say, if it's properly manifested, to contend with that in a noble way
and to rise above it and to transcend and to deal with it in large part, because we can make the world a much better place than it is for each of us individually and for our families and for our community. And we can constrain the malevolence, at least in our own hearts, and perhaps have a positive effect on those around us as a consequence. And that actually does make things better, and we actually can do that. And that's where the meaning in life is to be found. And that meaning, that goes along with the adoption of that kind of responsibility is actually the antidote to the suffering. You know that perfectly well, because all of you need a reason to get out of bed in the morning, especially on a rough morning, when things aren't going so well in your life. And there will be plenty of times when things aren't going so well in your life. And you still need a reason to get up and get moving and get out there. And if you have adopted the responsibility at an individual level to make things better, given how bad they are, if you've adopted the responsibility to make things better, then you have a reason to get up. And so one of the things that I've been stressing to people is that there's very little difference between the meaning in life that gives you fulfillment and that engages you in existence and the willingness to shoulder as much individual responsibility as you can possibly handle. Those are the same things. And that's a really useful thing to know. And you kind of know this, right? Everybody knows this because, first of all, if you're not living up to your responsibilities, even to take care of yourself, the probability that you're going to be ashamed of that at some level is extraordinarily high. And so your own soul tells you that you're in error, so to speak. But also, if you look at who you spontaneously admire, which is a good indication of where your value system really sits, you'll see that the people you admire are always people who take responsibility for themselves and responsibility for their family and responsibility for their community. We're cynically, it's often considered that we admire, let's say, the rich and successful because of their status and their wealth and their power. But that's a very shallow and it's very trivial, and I also don't really believe that it's true. I think that the people we admire are people who conduct themselves admirably in life, and you get a spontaneous admiration as a consequence of that, and that's a call from the deepest reaches of your being to imitate and to follow in that pathway, and you can do that. So there are constraints on how you can interact with the world in a successful manner. Let's assume that you don't want undue pain and anxiety. We could just start with that, and I think that's a reasonable proposition. You could tolerate some pain and anxiety if it's in the service of something greater, obviously, but I just mean pointless pain and anxiety. We don't want any more of that than is necessary. And that means that you have to take care of yourself to some degree. But the manner in which you take care of yourself is severely constrained. This is partly why you have to be intelligent and careful and plot your way through life properly. You have to take care of yourself today, but you have to take care of yourself today in a way that doesn't interfere with you taking care of yourself tomorrow and next week and next month and next year and 5 years from now and 10 years from now. So you can't do just what you want to in the next hour. Because if it's impulsive pleasure-seeking, let's say, something like that, excess alcohol use or excess drug use or careless sexual behavior or betrayal of people to gain you something in the moment, you're going to pay for that. You're going to pay for it tomorrow. You're going to pay for it next week and next month and next year. And so because you're going to exist in the future and because you have to live with yourself, there's only a certain number of ways that you can act that are going to work. But it's more than that. It's not just that you're responsible to your future self or the set of all your future selves, is that you also have to act in a way that works for your family. Because otherwise your family is going to disintegrate and break down and cause you and them all sorts of misery and grief. And not just your family now, but also your family into the future. And then not just your family either, but also your community. And so you have to set your aspirations so that they serve you in the broadest sense over a long period of time, and they also serve your family and they also serve your community, and that's a very tight set of constraints. And I think that the best solution to that set of constraints from a philosophical perspective, or maybe even a theological perspective, is to view the world as a place not of groups but of individuals, of sovereign individuals who are responsible for their destinies, responsible for their families and for their communities. And that's essentially the ethos of the modern West, because the thing that's so remarkable about the West, I would say, is that we did a wonderful job of articulating out the idea of individual sovereignty, and we made that the cornerstone of our political and economic systems. And the thing about that is, it works. And the evidence that it works is, well, it's right here in this room. Everything in this room is working, right? And around the world, increasingly, people are becoming economically better off at a rate that's absolutely staggering. And a huge portion of that is because we've articulated out the ethos of the responsible sovereign individual. And that's not the same as the individual with rights. It's not like rights are irrelevant, but rights are really there to facilitate your adoption of individual responsibility. One of the things I would like to say to all of you, and it's one of the things I really wanted to talk about coming here today when I was thinking about it, is that you don't want to play identity politics. And that can happen because it can be played on the right and the left, right? And that's a collectivist idea. You don't want to do that. What you could bring to the table that hasn't been brought to the table for years is an emphasis on individual responsibility. And the right way to do that, as far as I'm concerned, is to start with yourselves, is develop a vision for your life. You start to think about, if you could be who you could be, what would that look like? That's the beginning of a mature philosophy of being. If you could be the person that you would admire, who would that person be? How would you configure yourself? How would you configure your career, your education, your family, the use of time outside of work? If you wanted to be the noblest person that you could be, who was adopting the maximal amount of responsibility, how would that look? Then you need a strategy to put that into place. And that's the way you change things properly, and also the way you do the least amount of harm while you're changing them. You need a meaning to offset the tragedy of life. Otherwise, you just suffer stupidly, and you tend to make people around you suffer the same way. It's like not good.
What the modern left does.
Yes,
quite well.
And the way that you find that meaning is by adopting as much responsibility as you can. And what's also so fascinating about that is, you're characterized by an indefinite potential. And it isn't easy to understand exactly what that is, that potential, but it's what people call you on when they say, you're not living up to your potential, whatever that is. That potential will be called forth from you as a consequence of adoption of responsibility, because it won't manifest itself unless you take on a load. You're not going to develop in all the ways you could develop unless you set yourself a serious challenge, because it takes the challenge to pull that out of you, and also to motivate you to rid yourself of all the weaknesses and personality flaws that you've accumulated across the years, and to let those disappear and burn off you. You need to load yourself up before the demands of life will be such that you will discipline yourself properly. And a noble goal is a very good way of beginning that. Get your act together. You've got things to do in the world. The absence of your full being in the world leaves a hole that is filled by terrible things. At minimum, you have an ethical responsibility to ensure that the world doesn't devolve into something approximating hell. And at maximum, you have the responsibility, again, and it's a heavy ethical responsibility, to do everything that's in your power to make things as good as you can possibly make them, in this sophisticated manner that takes you and your family and your community into account. And it's on you, right? And that's meaning. People say, well, I'd like to have a meaningful life. It's like, well, fair enough, but the price that you pay for the meaning that transcends tragedy is the adoption of responsibility for the catastrophe of existence. But that ennobles you, right? It makes you into someone strong and someone competent and someone who's worthwhile and who lives in a manner that justifies their own suffering. And there's nothing better than you could possibly do than that.
Yeah, well, we're not animals in a zoo. Like we're not camels in a zoo. We're not herbivores, and just because we have enough straw doesn't mean we're going to lose our unbelievable capacity for destructive creation. And we don't know how to harness that. And I've been trying, I suppose, in some sense to meet that desire for a call to adventure with what I'm writing and with my lectures and to use responsibility in this moral domain as a as a battle that's of sufficient intensity to engage young people in particular property. It's like, get yourself together, see how difficult that is, see what you can do, put yourself together, stop doing the things you know to be wrong, and see what happens. Put yourself together. And there's been an unbelievable response to that. And I think it's harmless in some sense, or as harmless as such things can be, because it is focused. It's like, change you. Leave the other people alone. Or if you want to change them, maybe you can do it through example. You know, but they're not the problem. You have enough problems with yourself. It's like, well, what are you complaining about? You've got enough to eat. It's like, fair enough, you know, who wants to starve, right? And so it's even hard to fight against. Well, I should be grateful for that, and yes, you should, but it's not enough. And you think about where we came from, our ancestors, what they struggled against, and from the time we were, you know, from our animal forebears all the way up to where we are now, whatever we're made for, it's not Twinkies and TV. You know, it's not willful blindness and the comfort that brings. It's not enough, and so we need this adventure, and that's something we're going to all have to contend with, because if we don't get the adventure right, then we'll get it wrong, and it'll lead us in terrible places. One of the things I've said that people have repeated many times, and that it's in memes, and you can buy it on, you know, merchandise items and that sort of thing. A good man is a very dangerous man who has himself under control. And no one ever says that. So you say to young men, look, like, your job is to be as dangerous as you possibly can be in every possible direction, and to control that, right? Not to be harmless and slothful and contemptible even in your own eyes. And that way you get the power of the shadow. You don't have to dispense with the anger and the aggression. You can integrate it. And that's way better. I mean, I had a remarkable conversation with Jocko Willink. I felt that it was remarkable. It was very engrossing. And Willink, he's unlike me in many ways. I mean, he's a physical specimen of sort of unparalleled proportions to begin with. He's about 2 feet thick, you know, and he's this military guy, highly disciplined, and also extraordinarily morally integrated. And he's an admirable person, because the danger is right there under the surface. But he has it rather than it having him. And we're uncomfortable with the idea that that's the proper route for socialization. We try to teach our children that only, you know, cooperative games are acceptable, and they know in their hearts that that's a complete bloody lie. It's not technically sustainable. It's not even conceptually correct. I'm not saying I've solved it. I talk to Bjorn about this a lot. It's like, I love your message. Wouldn't it be wonderful to eradicate absolute poverty? And he does this great job technically of rank ordering global concerns, doing a cost-benefit analysis that's methodologically rigorous, and saying, look, we can devote money here. We'll get a 20-to-1 return. It's mostly in child nutrition, as it turns out. Couldn't we do an immense amount of good with targeted spending? And the answer is clearly yes. We could eradicate child poverty in the next 15 years. We probably will. We could do great things, but we don't know how to sell it. And that's a huge problem. I've never had more of a response from a crowd than when I draw a relationship between responsibility and meaning. Without fail, that brings the crowd to silence. And it's because that connection hasn't been made explicit sufficiently, I would say, is that we find meaning in responsibility. And there is a messianic call that's embedded in this. And you can translate that into get yourself together, see what you could become. And, you know, much of Beyond Order is exactly that. It's push your limits, move beyond yourself, discipline yourself, but move beyond that discipline. Don't let that order constrain who you could be, because it's not a high enough order yet. And I would say it looks like that is attractive to young people, and perhaps specifically to young men, but not only to young men, and not only to the young. So, well, that's a problem that we have to address is, we are doing a lot of things right, but it's not romantic enough. The clinical experience and my lecturing experience has been unbelievably positive in the main, and the clinical experience was positive because I was always on the side of the part of the person that was oriented towards their own health and improvement. That was part of our contractual pact. I'd often make that explicit. It's like, I'm not here for unconditional positive regard. I'm on the side of the part of you that wants everything to be better, and we're going to discover where that is, and we're going to work to facilitate it. And people loved that, and it was so gratifying to engage in that work. It was constantly positive. I worked with a huge variety of people, from people who had nothing, no gifts, and were just off the edges of the world, to people who were unbelievably talented and gifted, the whole gamut. And that was absolutely wonderful to see that range of people. And the lecturing has been the same way. Like, the lecture tour I did was immensely positive, too much positive even. You wouldn't think that would be possible, but it is possible. And I'm very positively oriented towards human beings in the main, despite I think we're great, flawed, and terribly, but no wonder. I mean, the burden we bear is absolutely, it's absurd. The existentialists made much of that. We have an absurd existence. We're aware of our own mortality. God, and we're animals. We're aware of our own mortality. What a burden, and yet here we are, and much of the time we're not corrupt and horrible. It's a miracle. So, it's a word of encouragement, and that's what people are responding so positively to in a time where everyone is told this story that, human activity is all a struggle for power, and that we're fundamentally a destructive force, and that we should rein ourselves in, and I'm not selling that message. It's a word of encouragement. You could be more than you are, and wouldn't that be great for everyone, including you?
So rule 1 is stand up straight with your shoulders back. And rule 2 is treat yourself like you're someone responsible for helping. And number 3, which is very tightly associated with number 2, they're sort of variations on a theme, is make friends with those people who want the best for you. And by the way, these last 2 rules aren't injunctions designed to make your life easier. They're actually injunctions designed to make your life more difficult. Kierkegaard said at one point that his role in life, given that everything was proceeding to become easier and easier in all possible ways, that there would come a time when people would cry out for difficulty. And so that's partly how he envisioned his role in the world, interestingly enough, as a universal benefactor of mankind who would strive to do nothing other than to make life more difficult for everyone. Right, and so rule 2 and 3 are like that, because treat yourself as if you're someone responsible for helping isn't the same as be nice to yourself. It's not that. And to associate with people who want the best for you means that they get to demand the best from you. And that's also not an easy thing. Rule 4 is compare yourself to who you were yesterday and not to who someone else is today. And that's an injunction about envy, right? It's easy. You need you need things that are above you, because you need to do something worthwhile with your life. You need something to aim at, but one of the consequences of that is that you can become envious of people that you believe have attained more in a deserved or undeserved manner, and that can make you bitter. And so it's much better to compare yourself to yourself and to use yourself as the target for improvement and comparison. Rule 5 is don't let your children do anything that makes you dislike them. And the rule of thumb there is if you dislike them, then other people will. And it's a bad idea to allow your children to act in a way that makes other children dislike them or adults dislike them, given that they're going to have to deal with children and they're going to have to deal with adults. So your primary responsibility as a parent is to help your child learn how to behave so that the social world opens up its arms to them and welcomes them at every level. And you've done your job if you can manage that, and it's not a simple thing to do. Rule 6 is put your house in perfect order before you criticize the world. And that's not take no action for others until you have your act together. That isn't what the rule means. It means that bind your ambition with humility and work on what's right in front of you that you will suffer for if you get wrong before you engage in the large-scale transformation of other people. Rule 7 is do what is meaningful and not what is expedient. And I would say in some sense that's the core ethos of the book. Not exactly, because Rule 8, which is tell the truth or at least don't lie, is a necessary conjunction to that, or a necessary additional element, because I don't think that you can pursue what is meaningful without telling the truth. And the reason for that is if you don't tell the truth, or let's say if you lie, which is an easier way to think about it, you corrupt the mechanisms, the instinctual mechanisms that manifest themselves as meaning, and then you can't trust them. And that's a very bad idea. So the fundamental reason to not lie is because you corrupt your own perceptions if you lie. And when you corrupt your own perceptions, then you can't rely on yourself. And if you can't rely on yourself, then, well, good luck to you. Because what are you going to rely on in the absence of your own judgment? You've got nothing if you lose that. Rule 9. Assume that the person that you're listening to knows something you don't. And that's not so much a mark of respect for the person, although it is that. It's a mark of recognition of your own unbearable ignorance. You know, one of the things you have to do in life, you have to decide what's more important, what you know or what you don't know. First of all, there's a lot of what you don't know. And so if you make friends with that, if you decide that's important, then, well, that's a good thing, because you're going to be surrounded by what you don't know your entire life. And so if you're appreciative of that, then that's going to make things go better for you. But the other element of that is, well, why should you be appreciative of what you don't know? And the answer to that is, well, you shouldn't. If your life is absolutely perfect in every way, you have exactly what you need and want, you've put everything in order around you, then what you know is sufficient. But if you believe that things could still be put right around you in your own personal life and with regard to the effect that you have on other people, then obviously what you don't yet know is more important than what you do know, and you should be paying attention to find out what you don't know at every possible moment. And if you're fortunate when you have a conversation with someone and you're actually interested in what they say, then even if they're not very good at communicating, even if they're awkward, or even if they display a certain amount of enmity towards you, there's always the possibility that they might tell you something you don't know, in which case you can walk away from the conversation less ignorant and corrupt than you were when you started the conversation. And if your life isn't everything that you would like it to be, then being slightly less ignorant and corrupt is probably a good thing. And so Rule 10 is be precise in your speech. And that's an observation, I would say, that's a variant of a New Testament injunction, which is, or maybe a description of the nature of the world, which is knock and the door will open, and ask and you will receive, which is a very strange theory, let's say, but which I would say is far more in accordance with what we know about the psychology of perception, let's say, than you might imagine, because it is the case that you don't get what you don't aim at. You might get what you do aim at, and your aim might get better as you aim as well, which is something to consider. If you specify the nature of if you specify the nature of the being that you want to bring into being, then you radically increase the probability that that's what will occur. And of course you all know that, because you regard yourself, at least to some degree, as active creative agents, right? Your fundamental attitude towards yourself, at least in the manner that you act towards yourself, is that you wake up in the morning and You have a landscape of possibilities that lay themselves open to you, and you make choices between those possibilities and determine in consequence how the world is going to manifest itself. So you confront a field of potential. That's a good way of thinking about it. And through your choices, you determine which elements of that potential are going to concretize themselves into the real world. And you are very unhappy with yourself if you don't do that properly, and you're very unhappy with other people if they don't do that properly, and you're very unhappy with other people if they don't treat you like that's what you're like. Because part of what you demand from people, let's say, in terms of sheer civility, is that they act towards you as if you're the locus of voluntary choice in a world of potential. And you upbraid each other for that as well. If you have children and parents, your parents will say to you, if you're fortunate, you're not living up to your potential, which is actually a compliment in a sense, even though it's also a judgment. And the compliment is, I know perfectly well that you could be more than you are. Rule 11 is don't bother children when they're skateboarding. And that's actually a discussion of courage, of encouragement, more specifically, because I've been trying to understand, for example, what role parents play in the lives of their children. And I would say this is a role that is of fundamental importance, as well as attempting to guide your children so that they act in a socially desirable manner, so that the world opens itself up to them. You also want to encourage them, which is not the same as sheltering them. It's not the same at all. And to encourage someone is to say something like, or to act out something like, look, kid, the world is a very hard place, and it's a bitter place in many ways, and it's not only a hard and bitter place, it's also touched with betrayal and malevolence, and that's the fundamental bottom line. But there's something in you that is capable of taking that full on and transcending it. And that's encouragement. You say, well, as difficult as things are, you're up to the challenge. So in Rule 12 is pet a cat when you encounter one on the street. And it's oddly enough, a meditation on fragility. It's a discussion of what you do when you don't know what to do. And that's really when things have gone badly for you, when you face a terrible tragedy in your own personal life, or in your familial life, or perhaps even in the life of your community, when things come crowding in at you too quickly. In the case of a death in the family, or a terrible illness, or the collapse of a dream, or any of the things that can flip your world upside down, is how do you cope with that? And that chapter contains a discussion of the necessity of narrowing your time frame, because sometimes the right way to look at the world is across years, and sometimes it's across months, and when things are more out of control, perhaps it's across days, and when you're really up against the wall, it's across hours or even minutes. And during those minutes, then you concentrate on doing as well as you can with what's right in front of you for the longest unit of time that you can tolerate conceptualizing.
retribution. Oh yeah, we want retribution. Oh yeah, we want retribution.